Welcome to the Babylonian Podcast. I'm Michael Light, and I'm a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. And on this podcast, I provide the perspective of Jews that lived just before Jesus, from texts that we have like the apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, and more. With scholars, sages, and scriptures, let's Bible on. In this podcast episode, I'm going to be going through the book of Tobit. The book of Tobit is an apocryphon. In other words, it was not a part of the Old Testament that Jesus and other Jews recognized. However, they did preserve and read it besides the scriptures to better understand it and to be encouraged by it. In the rest of this podcast episode, I'm going to be summarizing Tobit, and I'm going to be talking about how it helps us see it as a model of older Old Testament characters, as well as New Testament texts that may have been reflecting on Tobit. In a sense, the book of Tobit is impossible to summarize with just leaving out one detail or another, because every detail is important and plays into the whole story and is brought into some reversal or some part of the comedic genre of the book of Tobit. But I will give it my best shot to give a summary that most likely will not be succinct of the book of Tobit. Now, the book of Tobit sets its story during the exile, and it's about an Israelite living in Nineveh in Assyria. And most scholars thought that it was written in the 1st century or the middle of the 2nd century BC, until they found it among the Dead Sea Scrolls and concluded that it was probably written in the 3rd or 4th century BC. The book of Tobit is a rom-com. In fact, as far as I know, it's the only rom-com that we have preserved from the Second Temple Jewish period. So it's comedic in that it has all these just really weird and unexpected oddities that we'll get to as we go throughout the book. And it's a romance novella that talks about the love of two faithful, suffering Jews in exile. Now, while none of the characters in the book of Tobit are directly connected through genealogies, there is a genealogy of Tobit, but it doesn't connect him to anyone from the Hebrew scriptures. And there are no characters that are noted in the book of Tobit that are actually from the Hebrew scriptures. There are some that are noted in other Second Temple Jewish texts. And all the characters in Tobit are in some way or another based on other characters, one or multiple from the Hebrew scriptures, in one way or in another, and we'll be exploring this as we go throughout the book of Tobit. And if they aren't, all the meanings of the names are very significant and play into how the story goes and what that character means and how he acts. Now, there's a couple of different ways of breaking this up, as there is with any book, even biblical books. But the easiest way that I found to break it up is to break it up into 4 sections. Kind of an introduction, the journey of Tobias, the son of Tobit, Tobias coming to marry Sarah, and then Tobias's return. And then you can kind of say a conclusion, but I'm kind of putting the conclusion with his return. So with all that, let's jump into the summary of the book of Tobit. So the story starts by setting our character Tobit in the kingdom of Assyria, specifically Nineveh. It recalls how he was taken with the rest of the northern kingdom into exile because of their idolatry and their unfaithfulness to God. It then goes on to show Tobit's faithfulness in following the Torah, especially how he's always providing for the king everything that he needs, He's doing almsgiving, which just means he's giving money to the poor, and he's burying dead bodies when he encounters them. Now, if it seems weird that he's burying dead bodies, this is because in that time it was respectful to bury a body. For example, Elijah prophesies to Ahab how he will be killed and his body will be licked by the dogs. A body that's left exposed and out in nature is very disrespectful. And so this is even going to play into the story. But anyways, because Tobit has a good standing with the king, he's able to often trek to Media, far away, to make deposits to his trusted friend Gabael. However, it is precisely through his burying dead bodies that a new king searches for Tobit and tries to kill him. So Tobit runs to protect himself, and everything that he has is confiscated. Because of the new king, the way to Media is no longer safe either. The story goes on to show Tobit holding a feast celebrating Pentecost for his family after returning home and being under a new king. Tobit tells his son Tobias, who we are barely introduced to go and bring a person to eat with them for the feast, somebody who's poor. And so Tobias returns, and he says that he found a dead body that had been murdered, and it was left out in the market. Now, Tobit talks about how the king had been killing all these bodies and leaving them out as disrespect. And so when he finds that he was burying them, this is earlier on, he sent him out of the city, and he had to run for his life because the king was trying to kill him. So there's another king that's set in place. So actually the king is mentioned, and I believe it was Kings that he's mentioned in 2 Kings, where it's the king who comes knocking at the door of the southern kingdom of Judah, and says that he is going to attack it and take it down, and he ends up being sent back by God, and his own children kill him while he's worshiping. So Tobias returns at this meal for Pentecost, and Pentecost is a meal that celebrates the giving of the Torah, when God gave the Torah to Moses. And so Tobias returns to him, and he says he found this dead body in the market. And so Tobit takes no time. He jumps up and from his meal, and he goes to put the dead body in his own room so that he can bear it at sunset. And when he does this, he is actually mocked by his neighbors. His neighbors are like, "Oh, really? You just got kicked out because you just got kicked out of the city for burying dead bodies, and you're still burying dead bodies." And he's insulted by this. And Tobit goes back and he reads from the book of Amos, the prophet Amos. And this is in Amos 8:10, where it says, "Your festivals shall be turned into mourning, and all your songs into lamentation." And it says that he weeps. So after sunset, Tobit buries the body that he had in his room. And that night, Tobit sleeps under a wall. And it says that he didn't know that there were some sparrows that were sitting on that wall, and they poop on his eyes, and he becomes blind. And again, this is part of it being a comedy. It's just this really odd thing that he's sleeping under a wall, and then there happen to be these evil birds that poop on him. He goes to doctors to try and get it healed, and it actually just makes it worse. And so since he's blind, he can't work, so his wife, Anna, needs to work as a weaver to provide for their family. And again, women in this time could not earn the same money as men. It's a different level of shame in that society when it was the woman that had to do the working. And when she's given a goat as an extra wage, Tobit accuses her of stealing and commands her to take the goat back. So Anna's working one day, and she's given this goat as a bonus for her hard, good work. And she brings it back to Tobit, and Tobit says, "You must have been stealing. Go give that back. There's no way we got to go." And she insists that it was given to her rightly. And she even challenges Tobit, and she says, this is in chapter 2, verse 14, "Where are your acts of charity, your righteousness? Aren't you known for having these?" Tobit is crushed by the insults of all the other neighbors for burying the dead man and his wife, challenging his good deeds, so much that he breaks out in a depressed prayer, He confesses the sins of Israel, and he asks for God to take his life. At this very moment, the narrative takes us all the way over to Ecbatana, where someone named Sarah is accused by her maid of beating her. She says that to her father. And so she looks down on Sarah for all of her past 7 husbands dying and says that she even beat them to death. Sarah is also ashamed by the accusations of her maid and breaks out in prayer to God, saying that she cannot take any more of the false accusations or the shame from all her dead husbands, because again, it was the men that would have been working and providing for the women in that time, and it was shameful to not have any, to have all those husbands and they all die. Much more than in this society, even though that probably would be shameful in this society as well. Today in contemporary America, how much more in that time, not just for her, but for her whole family. And while she talks about her desire to commit suicide, she says that for the sake of not wanting to put that bad reproach on her father, she decides not to. But she does ask for God to end her life and says it would be better for her to die than to live. Another thing that she notes in her prayer is that the death of her husbands is actually caused by this demon that out of this demon's desire for her, actually kills the husbands on the first night of the marriage. So it's not that they spend some time with her, it's by the time that they're trying to consummate it, the demon, whose name is Asmodeus, kills them. And then the narrative just straight up tells us that God hears the prayer and sends the angel Raphael to rescue them, and pretty much just spoils the rest of the story and says how it's going to happen. So at that point in the story, you're not really left wondering what's going to happen as much as how is it going to happen. And for your sake, I'm not really going to spoil it right now, even though I am going to spoil it later, because I much rather like the surprise than just the dramatic irony. But you are left thinking, what do these characters know? What do they not know? Because, for example, Sarah knows that it's a demon that's killing her husbands, but her maid doesn't. And her father may even believe her maid, who says that she's the one that killed her husbands. Although that's not really true. We'll see later on in the story. But there's a lot of dramatic irony throughout this story, because, again, it's a rom-com. It's a romantic comedy. So, actually, at this point, pretty much everything that is connected to a Second Temple Jewish text is noted at this time, and so I thought it would be good to kind of talk about these references, or at least commonalities that it has with other texts from its time. So, and it doesn't mean that this person read these other texts or that these other texts read this person, but at least that there was a tradition in common and that they were both hearing the same thing. Or it's possible that they did actually read these texts. But I just want to make that clear, that that does not mean that one person read the text of the other. So anyways, Raphael and Asmodeus. If you are reading a Protestant Bible, you will notice that, well, first of all, there is no, as far as I can remember, no demon is ever named. And second of all, out of all the angels that are named, Raphael is never named. Although I think that before I read this text, I even kind of had a little bit of knowledge that there was probably some angel named Raphael in traditions, but this is actually a tradition that precedes the time of the Incarnation. We see it in texts like 1 Enoch. I believe it's the first section that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Watchers that refers to the 7 angels. And the idea of there being 7 angels before the throne is even in the Book of Revelation, although it doesn't name them. Raphael's a very commonly named angel among the Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic stories. When it does name the angels, it names Raphael behind Michael and Gabriel. And Raphael and Asmodeus are both named in a really weird book from the Second Temple period called the Testament of Solomon, that talks about Solomon having these demons come to him when he's building the temple, and he uses these different medicines and cures to fight them and force them to make the temple. I know it's really weird, and Raphael and Asmodeus are each demon has their own medicine that attacks them, and that'll even be referenced in this text. But they also have their own opposing angel, and Asmodeus and Raphael are opposing angels and demons. And so, with that being said, it says that God hears their prayer and sends the angel Raphael to rescue them. Also, in passing, Tobit mentions this person named Ahikar, who is of nobility, and he mentions a whole little predicament about him at the end. This is one of the details. This is really not that important. But there is a text called Ahikar that is part of, generally grouped with the pseudepigrapha. And so it's a wisdom text, and it talks about the plot of within nobility for somebody to try and murder and gain their way to the top. And Ahikar is a good person who's wise, and it shares all his wise words. So those are all the direct references. There is also a reference that I'm going to get to in a second, that there is no other known reference besides this, as far as I remember, but it talks about Noah marrying someone of his same family, and that is also found in the book of Jubilees, although there isn't any other text that talks about that. Oh, and also in the Talmud, I did not write down the reference specifically, but the Talmud calls Asmodeus the prince of demons. So, getting back into the story, we get to the second major section. And Tobit remembers that he had earlier left money with his friend Gabael in Media. And remember that the road to Media was unsafe because of the king. And so Tobit thinks that it'll be better for him to actually tell his son about the money that he left with Gabael, so he can get that before Tobit dies. Tobit calls his son Tobias to him to instruct him on how to bury him and to later bury his wife with him. And then he exhorts Tobias to honor his mother for all the hard work she's done in raising him, and to give and to honor God, to give to the poor, almsgiving, and for Andromony. Andromony is marrying within one's own tribe or family, not brother to sister, so as to say, a little bit further out of that, but like the patriarchs, like Isaac and Jacob, it's marrying within one's own family. It's also even prescribed in the Torah that you are to marry within your own tribe, so that the inheritance and the land allotments are all the same. And so Tobit then sends his son, whose name is Tobias. He sends him to look for a companion to take him to Media, because he says that he wants for him to be safe and for him to know the road there, since Tobit no longer went there, and Tobit is blind, so Tobit obviously can't take him there. And Tobias goes out, and he instantly comes across the angel Raphael. However, the angel Raphael is disguised as a regular person named Azariah. So this Azariah tells him that he knows the way to Media, and assures him that he's related to Gabael, and he even proves his father Tobit that he's of the same tribe, and he's loyal to the Torah, so he can be trusted. And it's not like he just goes out and says it. This all just comes out through natural conversation. Again, this is part of just the irony of the comedy. So Tobit agrees and sends the two of them on their way, and it's really interesting that all of a sudden it's mentioned that a dog goes with them. And I'll go into this a little bit later about the importance of there being a dog, but that's a very interesting little detail that's added in there. On their way, Tobias goes to wash his feet in the Tigris River, and he's attacked by this huge fish. And Azariah tells him to slay the fish, but to keep the heart and the liver and the gall. He says that the heart and liver can be burned by someone who's afflicted by a demon, and the demon will have to leave that person forever. Something I forgot to note, by the way, is that Ecbatana is in Media. and Sarah lives in Ecbatana. So Sarah over in Ecbatana in Media, and he has to keep this heart and liver, and if he burns it, then somebody afflicted by the demon will be freed from that affliction. He says to also keep the gall because it can be put on a blind person's eyes and make them able to see again. So at this point in the story, you can obviously see how these are going to be used. Again, it's just waiting to see how these things can be, how it's going to turn out. As you can see, also, things are just strange. Again, it's a comedy. There's a big giant fish that jumps out and tries to attack him. It's somewhat similar to the book of Jonah, where a fish swallows Jonah and preserves him, which is also a comedy, because fish don't normally swallow people. And so they continue their miraculously short journey, and Azariah, he tells Tobias, he says, there's this person named Sarah, we're about to go and stay with her father in Ecbatana, just so you know, and you have the right by the levirate marriage law to marry her. Now, the law of levirate marriage is, as you know from the book of Ruth, most likely, that's where it's most popular, but it's also in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 6 or 7, and it's the law about when somebody's husband dies, when a wife's husband dies, women needed husbands to provide for them and for security in those times. That's just how it was. So the levirate marriage law was who would be next in line to marry that person. And he says, by that law, you are next in line. And he says, Tobias is like, yeah, but she's had 7 husbands and they've all been killed by this demon. And Raphael says, yeah, don't worry, idiot, that's why I gave you the gallbladder, the heart and the liver. And so he exhorts him to marry her, and he says, pray before your first night, and then burn the fish liver and the heart, and it'll ward off the demon. And so that's their journey there, and in the next section, they come, and Tobias and Azariah come, they stay with Sarah and their family, and Sarah's father's name is Raguel, and her mother's name is Edna. And so they go and they meet them, they stay with them, and they ask how Tobit is doing, and Tobias actually doesn't even really answer them. And then, so Tobias is pretty straightforward. He asks Azariah, hey, tell them that I need to marry Sarah, and they're at this feast, by the way, and he tells Azariah, tell them that I can marry him. And the father, Raguel, tells him, he says, just so you know, every time that she marries a husband, a demon kills her. And he explains, I'm next in line, and he says, yeah, I know, I agree, you are next in line according to the laws of levirate marriage. And so they're freaking out, and they're pretty distressed. The mother is weeping, but she encourages Sarah. She says, it's okay, go ahead and do it. And they think that he is for sure going to die. But Tobias and Sarah go up to their room to consummate the marriage, and they burn the fish liver and the heart. And Asmodeus leaves it says that he goes all the way down to Egypt. And Raphael follows him and binds him up. Then Tobias leads Sarah in prayer, and they bless God for their marriage, and they ask for a long and happy marriage. And then we're taken outside the room, where we see Sarah's parents digging a grave. Raguel is digging a grave, and he says, well, I'm sure he's going to die, most likely, so we'll just dig this grave to prepare it. And we can bury them in secret, and nobody will know that they got married, and we won't bring this shame to the family. However, they do send their maid to their room to see if they're alive anyway, and the maid finds them both sound asleep together. And so he quickly goes and fills up the grave again so that nobody finds out that he's going to do that. And he blesses God, and then they all wake up the next morning, and they have a marriage feast that's double the size of a regular one. And it goes even 14 days. And Raguel, the father of Tobit, actually gives him half of all he has, and he says, whenever I die, you can have everything. Tobias is then, he turns to Azariah throughout this feast, and he says, my parents have to be worrying about me. I still haven't even gotten the money from Gabael, so he sends Azariah to go to Gabael to go get the money that he originally needed to get. Azariah goes, brings Gabael. Gabael comes with camels and all that he has, and he brings the money, and he blesses them for their marriage, and so then they go. He blesses Tobias, his wife, and his whole family. Then we're taken to the final section of the book, where we see Tobias's parents worrying that he has died. The mother thinks that surely he died. She's been waiting on him every single day. And Tobias knows that his parents are worrying for him, so he pressures his father a lot. You know, this is a motif of the father is like, no, stay, you have to stay. And Tobias he's a pretty direct person. He's like, no, I have to go. They're worrying about me. So he lets him go. And on coming back, Tobias is reminded of the fish gall again by Azariah. Azariah says, hey, by the way, you got that fish gall, in case you can't remember that the one blind person that you know is your father. So go ahead and apply it to his eyes. So he gives it to his father's eyes, and he is healed. And so they celebrate their return, and they have another marriage party. The next day, Tobit reminds his son Tobias to pay Azariah for going with him, and to even give him a bonus. So Tobias tries to pay him, but then Azariah reveals that he was the angel Raphael who had heard the prayer of Tobit and Sarah when they asked for death. He says that he was actually testing Tobit through the insults of the townspeople when he decided to bury the dead body that he found on Pentecost. And then Raphael simply ascends into heaven, and Tobit praises God. Lastly, Tobit calls Tobias and all of his 7 sons, this is when we find that they had 7 sons, to his bedside, and he exhorts him one last time before he dies. He tells him again to give to the poor and to move back to Ecbatana in Media, as Nineveh and Assyria will be judged, just as the prophet Nahum had said. And he says he believes in all the prophets, and he says that God's going to be faithful to call back all Israel to Jerusalem, and all the nations will join in worshiping God forever. And Tobit dies at a good old age. And then we see that Tobias goes to live in Ecbatana with his father-in-law and their family. They die, and he inherits all that they have, and he lives a long, happy life. And he sees Nahum's prophecy of the destruction of Nineveh come true. So this story is a pretty fantastic story. Like I said before, this is the first extra-biblical book that I ever read. And I'm glad it was, because there are a lot of books that I could have gotten very bored by, but this was not going to be one of them. And I hope that you're interested to read it for yourself. But you may be asking, okay, that's an entertaining story, but what does it even mean, and why is it important? Again, it doesn't have any direct connections to the Old Testament, but first I'm going to show you a little bit of what the story is doing in and of itself, and how it's working there. Then I want to show you its connections to Hebrew Scriptures characters, and how all the characters in this are modeled after that. And then after that, I'm going to show you some of the interesting things that it notes just in general, and then some of the connections that it may have to the apostolic writings, the New Testament. So I actually wasn't even that aware of any of this until my third time, this time, reading through this text. But at the very end of this text, you can see kind of the symmetry of the entire narrative. There's an introduction to who Tobit is. There's his suffering and his cry out to God. There's God's answer and the journey. Then there's his time with Sarah and their consummation of their marriage, their journey back, the healing and relief from Tobit's suffering, and then there's the conclusion with Tobias. So you can kind of see all the different reversals that are happening throughout this. You can see how Tobit's faithfulness in the first section only results in him losing his good standing, his possessions, and even his sight. But all this is reversed by the end of the book. So remember, Tobit is always giving to the poor. He's doing almsgiving and providing for the king. Despite this, he's sent out of his city. The king tries to kill him, and his neighbors laugh at him, and only his wife can work to provide for him. So even though he's providing for the poor, he becomes poor himself. And even though he provides for the king, a new king tries to kill him. So then, it's in the last section of the book where he receives not only the money that he had later left with Gabael, but also the money that his son Tobias was given him by his father-in-law. Then remember how he always buried the dead, even on Pentecost? Well, that only resulted in the king trying to have him dead and kill him for burying the bodies of the people he murdered. But at the end of the book, he is spared from his blindness. Because of his blindness, he wanted to die, and he even was expecting it, and that's the whole reason why he sends out his son Tobias. But by the end of the book, he is given great eyesight, and it even talks about him living longer than 100 years. And then there's also Sarah. Now, Sarah had lost 7 husbands, and she seemingly brought shame to her whole family. But then by the end of the book, she's not only given a great husband who's faithful to the Torah, but she's given 7 sons to make up for her 7 husbands, and in-law parents that are also faithful to God. So in this last part, I wanted to talk about the meaning of the names. So the whole book can be defined by the meaning of the names. So in the beginning of the book, there's this genealogy. I think it goes back 7 people, but I can't remember. But anyways, Tobit has a father named Tobiel. And I'm getting all these names mixed up as one would, because they're all Tob names. Now, the Hebrew word Tov means good. So Tobiel, and El means God. So Tobiel means God is good. Tobias means my good. No, I'm so sorry. Tobiel means God is good. Tobit means my good. And Tobias comes from the Hebrew, which would have been Tobiah, which means Yah is good, Yahweh, or the Lord. So his son and father, in their name, are the meaning of the significance of the book. That God, the Lord God, is good. That's what the whole book is about. The faithfulness of God to those who are looking out for the poor and those who are in need. It reminds me of what James says at the end of the first chapter. The true religion is to look out for the poor and the orphan. And that's exactly what this book is about. How even though it seemed like he was suffering for looking out for the poor and constantly giving to them and burying the dead, these are people that can't do anything for themselves. A dead person can't cover his shame and crawl into a grave, and a poor person can't provide for himself. But he is living faithfully according to the Torah, and he's burying these dead people that can't do it themselves, and he's giving alms to the poor people. And it's exactly because of that that God. It says that God tests him, and I think the point of that is: are you going to, even in the middle of your meal where you're supposed to be celebrating, go out and bury this dead person? There's a lot of emphasis on burying dead people and providing for the poor. There are some other moral exhortations that are a little bit more minor, like paying workers promptly, and that's important. But really, the ones that are traced throughout the entirety of this book are burying the dead and giving alms to the poor. And those are people that can't provide for themselves. And through those reversals, you can see that this book is trying to share how God is good through all of that. And then you even get to see how Tobit's faithfulness to the law and to giving to the poor and those in need even extends to his daughter-in-law through his son. A couple other interesting things to note in this book is that all of these reversals are hinged on this fish. Well, a lot of them come through these birds that poop on his eyes. He becomes blind, so then he can't work for himself, so then he becomes poor after having already left the city and all his stuff being confiscated. So there's these evil animals that cause it. And then there's this fish that tries to attack and swallow the leg of his son Tobias on the way. And it's through killing that fish and using its guts that there's healing not only for Sarah, but also for Tobit. And that's part of the comedy. I think that's just so poetic, as weird as it is. Another interesting thing is the one direct quotation. While he does name Nahum and say that Nahum is the one that prophesied that Nineveh is going to fall, and so his son Tobias should move at the end of the book, the one quotation from the Old Testament is taken from Amos. And he talks about how songs will be turned into lamentation. And, that's what happens in the first section. But in the end, the exact opposite happens. And it's actually the lamentations, the cries of distress, and the desire for death that's turned into new life and abundance of age. It's also interesting, Tobit has his own struggle with his wife Anna, and his accusation of her presupposing that she stole a goat. And in the same way, Raguel's father is told by the maid of Sarah that she's the one that beat her husbands to death when she didn't do anything wrong. So you have both of those things going on. The false accusation even of a woman. And it's through that fish, again, that fish, its guts, that is going to exorcise that demon and heal Tobit and bring healing to both sides of those relationships and restore the proper fame, so as to say, of both of those people. And he's even set right with the king and given his job again through at the end of it, when he's granted his eyesight again. Also in this book, there are a couple of different motifs that are found in the other scriptures and in other Second Temple Jewish texts. There is the test, and that's just the idea of God testing people, and it's like in Genesis 22:1, it just says that God tested Abraham straight up. It's found in the beginning and throughout the book of Job, and all throughout the scriptures, even Genesis 2-3. Then there's the testament, and a testament is kind of like a little genre. Some texts are just entirely testaments, not biblical, but extra biblical texts. And that's just at the end of someone's life, they call all their sons or grandsons, and they give them moral exhortations. And that's exactly what happens at the end of this. And there's this idea of the resurrection, where all these things, again, are turned on their heads. Everybody thought that Tobias was dead. His mother thinks that he's dead, and so she's telling Tobit that at the end before they come back, and Tobit says no, he's not dead. He has to be alive. And in the same way, during his marriage, his father-in-law Raguel is preparing a grave for him. Throughout the rest of this book, burying dead people is exhorted. But in that moment, he's about to be buried himself. And in a sense, he kind of is. It seems like he did die, but then he is given kind of like a resurrection in both of those senses. Now, I did also want to point out a couple of oddities, or things that I found a little bit interesting. So, one question I had is it important that Tobit came from the tribe of Naphtali? It talks about that. I looked through the testament of the patriarch, it's eluding me now, Israel, not the Second Temple Jewish text, but at the end of Genesis, to see what he talks about Naphtali. And he talks about his faithfulness, but I don't want to take that as a direct connection. I also looked at the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, where Moses talks about all the different tribes, and I didn't see any reason why he would be from Naphtali. So I wonder if that's just to make it more historical, so as to say. I also really wondered why Tobias never meets Sarah at a well. That is a very big motif of characters meeting their wives at a well. Not only is that true with Isaac's messenger, but that's also true for Jacob and for Moses. And while Ruth doesn't meet Boaz at a well, she meets him. She asks him to marry him at the threshing floor, and he meets him out in the field. And I think that's the whole point of it, is that someone meets their woman in a place where they're working hard and being industrious. And, one of the interesting things is there isn't a lot about Sarah. The only words that Sarah says throughout her whole time is she says, "Amen, amen." And before, that's at the end of the prayer that she said, that Tobias says on their wedding night. And at the beginning of the book, she has a whole lamentation. But besides that, she does not say a single word. And I just find that pretty interesting. She is redeemed, so as to say. Her demon is exorcised, but there's nothing more said. Now, her maid does accuse her of beating her. But you wonder how true that is, because in a sense, that's told right after the story of Tobit falsely accusing his own wife of stealing a goat. And his wife is the one working and providing for him, and so, I'm a little bit dubious about that. It seems that Sarah's handmaid is kind of set in line, challenging her in the same way that Tobit's wife is challenging him after he falsely accuses her. And so, and also, she accuses her of beating her husbands to death, and we know that she doesn't beat her husbands to death, because it's actually the demons that do that. So some other interesting things, again, if you guys actually have ideas on all that stuff, why see from Naphtali, why do they not meet at the well, or maybe you had a different explanation for that, I would love to hear that. So feel free to reach out to me in any way. But some other interesting things that I found as I was reading through the book of Tobit is I found there's one reference where it seems that Tobit exhorts Tobias to leave food on the graves of the dead, and it seems like that is for feeding them. So it seems that he would take his belief of the resurrection even to a very different extent to where you can even feed them while they're dead. Now, it's not very conclusive. He doesn't say that they can eat it or why it is that they leave it there. But I lean towards that interpretation, that it is based on the presupposition that they can eat that. Another interesting thing is what I kind of reference to as matrimonial predestination. And that is... Raphael, when he's exhorting Tobias before they go to Sarah's house, is he says, you guys were pretty much predestined to be together. And then that's in 6:18, and then also in 7:11, I think it's Raguel who tells him, yeah, you guys were predestined to be together, which is interesting because he's nervous and even hesitant to give her over. Another interesting thing, not all Jews believed in the resurrection from the dead at that time. Like it notes in the New Testament, the Sadducees disagreed with it, and probably other Jews as well. But there seems to be a reference to the resurrection of the dead in Tobit 13. Also, there were some Jews who emphasized more of the need to destroy all the Gentiles and establish only Israel, and they didn't focus as much on Gentiles being converted. Now, this doesn't really talk about Gentiles being converted so much in their own time as it does look forward to all Gentiles coming, all the nations coming to worship at Jerusalem. So the author may not have been such a big fan of proselytism in his own time, but he definitely saw it as something to come in the eschaton, the age to come. And then another interesting thing is that two times towards the beginning and the end, in 6:2 and 11:4, we see that dogs are good. There's this companion dog that goes with him, and even in some manuscripts, I'm reading through the NRSV version, the New Revised Standard Version, but there are other different manuscripts, and some of them say that, in other parts of the text, that the dog was owned by Tobias. But it just says that this dog went out with him on the journey and that it returned with him. And the dog is portrayed as domesticated, which is so interesting because that is not in the rest of the entire Hebrew Scriptures or the New Testament. And now I do want to be cautious about this because this is a comedy. And again, there are these evil birds that poop on Tobit's face. There's a big fish that jumps out and bites his foot. But even the idea of birds being evil is in line with birds going and eating at dead bodies. The idea of a fish swallowing someone's leg is in line with the picture of Jonah and him being swallowed by a fish, even though that's also a comedy. And I think the interesting thing is that the birds are evil, but the dog is actually good. I'm not sure that that's a reversal, and I'm not sure the other way, but I think that's something to be noted. Whether that's just for this text, that this is different from the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, because a lot of scholars are saying that the Bible portrays dogs as being bad. And while I would definitely agree with the Hebrew Bible, and you can do a concordance search and look at dogs, and they are not at all domesticated in Israelite society. There's even a video on it by Religion for Breakfast that I watched. But in this story, again, this could just be part of it being a comedy, but even then, there's still these birds that are pooping on I'm mixing Tobias and Tobit. It's so hard with these two almost same names. On Tobit's head, they don't necessarily poop on people's heads in the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures. They do eat away at people's bodies. And this dog is portrayed as good and a companion, even though it doesn't do anything. And so the reason that I share this and put so much weight on this is because in the Gospels, there's this Phoenician woman, this Canaanite, who comes to Jesus, and she asks for healing, and Jesus kind of talks about his priority for the Jews, and she says, even the dogs will eat from underneath the table. And some people say, like, oh, Jesus is racist and evil and all this. And it is pretty hard to make sense of, I'll give you that. But I think Tobit could give some of its own wisdom into that, in that it's one text where dogs are portrayed as good. And I don't remember any other texts that do that, but if I do, I will certainly note them. And if you do, certainly let me know. So how does Tobit connect to the New Testament? So I kind of wanted to first talk about its relevance for the New Testament. So Tobit, in his exhortation before he thinks he's going to send off Tobias, he says to give alms from your possessions, and do not let your eye begrudge the gift when you make it. Don't turn your face away from anyone who's poor, and the face of God will not be turned away from you. And this is connected from, I saw it as kind of a little bit of a connection to the New Testament, and especially this idea, while it's different language, that Jesus says whenever you give alms, don't sound a trumpet before you, like the hypocrites. But don't let your left hand know what your right hand. And that's what I think that's pretty similar to Tobit saying, don't let your hand begrudge you. And then in Mark 12:43 through 44, he says, he talks about this poor widow who's put in more than all those who have contributed to the treasury. And she gave out of everything that she had to live on. Out of her poverty, she gave what she had to live on. And that's very much connected to, Tobit talks about giving from the little that you have. And that's also talked about in Luke 21:3 through 4. That's just a parallel between the different Gospels there. Later on in Tobit 4:8 through 9, it says, if you have many possessions, make your gift from them in proportion. If you do not be afraid to give in accordance to the little you have. And so then, listen to this. This is very reminiscent of New Testament language. Or rather, New Testament language is very reminiscent of this. So you will be laying up a good treasure for yourself against the day of necessity. You can easily hear the words of Jesus when he says that you're laying up a treasure for yourself in heaven. But he talks about the more immediate day of necessity. And you see this in Luke 6:23. Rejoice in the day and jump for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven. And that's talking about laying up in the day of necessity. And in Luke 22:33, it says to again build up your treasure in heaven, sell your possessions, give alms, so that you'll have an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes and no moth destroys. And in Matthew 6:19 through 20, it says, "Store up for yourselves not treasure on earth, where moth and rust come and consume, but up in heaven, where there is neither moth nor rust." Now, Tobit does not have the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but it does have what I've heard called the silver rule of do not do to others what you would not have done unto you. Or as it says in 4:15, what you hate, don't do to anyone. And it made me reflect a little bit on, I had always thought of the golden rule and the silver rule kind of way, as in, I'm not going to do this to you because I wouldn't want you to do it to me. But it's really actually, no, whatever you do want done to you, you should go far and do that. So this is the negative statement, and the positive statement is in Luke 6:31 and Matthew 7:12. In Hebrews 13:2, it says, "Don't neglect to show hospitality for strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it." Now, it's not certain that this apostolic writer had Tobit in his mind. He surely had Genesis 18, where Abraham is providing for the angels that come disguised to him. However, I think it's fair to say that this lines up with that. It falls into the same category, whether or not he had this in mind, in that they provide for Raphael. They want to even give him an extra bonus. And Raphael says, he comes out and he actually shows that he was disguised the whole time. Hebrews 1:14 also says, "Are not all angels spirits in the divine service sent for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?" And in Tobit 12:12 it says, "Now when you and Sarah praised, it was I who brought and read the record of your prayer before the glory of the Lord, and likewise whenever you would bury the dead." And so it's kind of this similar idea of these angels mediating on behalf of them and bringing their prayers to God, which is in other apocalyptic texts as well. Tobit 12:15 says, Raphael says, "I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord." And Revelation 8:2, like other apocalyptic texts, says, "I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and the 7 trumpets were given to them." 7 angels before God's presence is there, like in other Second Temple Jewish texts. And then you see Raphael's ascension is in some way similar to the narrative mention of Jesus' ascension in Acts chapter 1. So Tobit 12:20 through 22. "So now get up from the ground and acknowledge God. See, I am ascending to him who sent me. Write down all these things that have happened to you." And he ascended, and they stood up and could see him no more. And then they bless God and they praise him. And in Acts 1:9 through 10, when he said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took them out of sight. And while he was going, and they were gazing up toward heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them. So just this idea of him ascending into heaven while they're talking, and they're just watching until they can see him no more. So finally, I wanted to talk about how all of these characters are modeled after characters from the Hebrew Scriptures. So, for example, Tobit is like Job in that he's tested. It's even very similar how he is challenged by his wife. And his wife says, "What good are your good deeds doing for you?" And that's very much like his wife telling Job to curse God. And in a lot of ways, he's also like Abraham. Again, he is hospitable to the angel Raphael, even though he doesn't know it. And in the way that he also sends out Raphael, who is an angel, as a messenger to get a wife for him. Although this time he doesn't even know that he's going to get a wife for him. Now, if you didn't know, the word angel literally just means messenger, which is really interesting. He also says that God will send a messenger with them, just like the messenger that goes to look for Isaac's wife prays and asks for God to send a messenger to go before him and show him the wife for Isaac. So that's pretty interesting, his connections there to Job and to Abraham. Now, if you couldn't tell, the character Anna is, which is the wife of Tobit, is a lot like Hannah. Not only in their names being spelled similarly, but in them also being, Anna is falsely accused by her husband of stealing a goat that she had worked hard for. And in the same way, Hannah is accused of being drunk. Like, put away your wine, woman. And she stands up for herself and says, no, I'm praying sorrowfully because I'm full of just anguish. And at the end, she gives up hope and thinks that her son is going to die. And she says that the son is the light, is her light, the light to her eyes. Which is also just, side note, it's just really interesting because the character Tobit is blind. And so whenever he's healed from that blindness, he can see the light, he can see his son. And he also calls his son a light. Tobias is like Isaac. Again, these are very much connected to the patriarchal stories from Genesis 12 following. Tobias is like Isaac, who goes with the messenger to look for the wife for him. He also even has to find somebody from his family. And then he comes back with extra provisions and with his wife on camels. And that's also kind of like how that works out with the Isaac story. That also... it's very interesting that Gabriel is said to have come with camels and all this stuff. And in the same way, when he goes, they have this feast. He finds out that they're actually related. And so he's kind of based off of the character Isaac. Sarah, if you couldn't tell, is based on the character Sarah from Genesis. But instead of not being able to have a husband... instead of not being able to have a son, as Abraham's wife is, she's not able to have a husband, and she's deeply distressed by this. And now, you may be saying, oh, well, like, where are you getting these connections from? Well, it's very interesting because her handmaid accuses her of beating her. And that is actually, it seems that that's actually linked to Hagar, who's oppressed by Sarah, because she actually does get a son through Abraham. And so Sarah oppresses her and she goes off. And so that seems like that's one of the things that really solidified that for me. Continuing on, Raguel, the father of Sarah, his name is pretty similar to the name of Zipporah's father, the father-in-law of Moses, Reuel. Now, I don't really know what the why these are similar, to be honest. Actually, I think it's a little contradictory because Moses actually marries an Ethiopian woman, and even Miriam and Aaron get on him for this, and that's when God punishes them. And so I don't really get that because there's a big push for androgyny and marrying within one's own family, but. That was noted by the scholar that was making the notes in the Oxford Annotated Edition, which there's just minimal notes, and so some of these notes were actually helping me out find stuff. But quite a bit of this I found on my own, but I think it is good. So let me just say anyways, in case you're interested in the notes that I found from here, the notes on the Book of Tobit are by the scholar Amy Jill Levine. And I looked it up to see if she had any lectures or podcasts or anything where she talks about it, and there's nothing. There's maybe like a one sentence summary for every verse or so maximum. There's not a whole lot, but there are a couple of quite a few of these biblical references were noted by her, but there are also quite a few connections that I made on my own that were not made by her. So I did want to give that credit there. Oh, it's also very interesting that Edna, the mother of Sarah, her name is similar to Eden, and that was also noted by her. So anyways, that's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting that Tobit, Tobias, and Tobiel, even though they're based off of some of these characters, are not actually their names aren't similar to these characters at all, and I think that just has more to do with the meaning of the book about God being good. And just to solidify this even more, as I'm looking around at my notes, I just remembered that Tobit even exhorts Tobias to be like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in marrying someone from his own tribe. So that should solidify even more kind of the connections that he has there. If you wanted to really stretch it, you might say that maybe Tobias's double-lengthed wedding that's 14 days could be compared to the 14 years that Jacob worked for Laban, although I wouldn't really go that far. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. I am not going to be uploading weekly. My plan is to just upload whenever I finish a text and I've done enough research on it. I want to upload that. And again, all these notes of biblical references, I also kind of made a sort of read scripture fan work, I guess you could say, where I summarize all this. These were both very helpful as I was going back through my notes in this podcast, and those will be both in the description to this episode. You will also be able to find on my website my full bibliography that I'm always updating for everything I'm listening to, watching, or reading on anything, including the apocrypha. So I also found some stuff out. David De Silva has a lecture series that I'm going through along with the apocrypha, and he talks about the emphasis of exhortation and morality in this book, not so much connections to the Older New Testament. But you can also find that on my website under Works and Writings. It's called Scholars and Sages on the Scriptures. But with all that said, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to give it a great review and share it on social media and with your friends and anybody that you think is interested. With that said, I'll see you next time in Babylonia.